For today's video, I'm going to try and simplify aquatic plants for beginners. To get started, I want to go over the main types of aquatic plants and how they actually work in our aquariums. First up are rhizome plants like Anubias, Java Fern, Bulbita and Bucephalandra. These plants have horizontal rhizomes where their leaves and stems grow from, and they are best used attached to hardscape like rocks or driftwood instead of being buried in the substrate. This is because burying the rhizome can cause it to rot, resulting in the plant melting. Rhizome plants, especially varieties from the Anubias barteri species, are particularly hardy and beginner friendly, and they are usually low maintenance due to their slow growth rate. Because of their epiphytic nature needing to be secured to hardscape, they also draw their nutrients from the water column, so you don't need an expensive, nutrient-rich substrate for your tank. Next up are stem plants such as Rotala, Hygrophila, Limnophila and Ludwigia. These typically grow vertically, but there are some varieties such as pearlweed which will eventually spread out horizontally to dominate the space. Just like a lot of other types of aquarium plants, there's also plenty of beginner-friendly options of stem plants on the market, and because they grow so quickly, they can help maintain water parameters and overcome some common beginner mistakes. One of the biggest advantages of stem plants is just how easy they are to propagate, because you can just trim the healthy tops off the stems and then replant them into your substrate, and a brand new plant will grow from that trimming. Not only does this help to keep your costs as low as possible, but it can also quickly and easily thicken out an area of your tank with plants. Then we get to stolon plants like Helinthium telenum green, Dwarf Sagittaria and Vallisneria. While these also grow vertically like stem plants, they also send out horizontal runners that let them self-propagate and quickly take over your tank. Now this can sound like an easy win because you get more plants for your money, but it can quickly get out of hand. One example of this in my own fish room right now is in my Celestial Pearl Danio tank, where the Dwarf Sagittaria is just starting to send out runners everywhere as things heat up, and it's becoming a challenge to maintain it, and I'm just leaving it to dominate the tank now. Floating plants are up next, and these include water lettuce, salvinia, redroot floaters, Amazon frogbit and of course duckweed. These usually tend to be very beginner friendly, but if you have surface level water flow they can become problematic. As the name suggests, floating plants rest on the surface of your aquarium water, and because they have easy access to atmospheric CO2, they grow at a rapid pace. Just like stem plants, this lets them absorb a lot of nutrients out of the water column to maintain safe and stable water parameters for your fish. Although some people do disagree with this next part, I personally do agree that they can be used as a sort of soft lid on the tank to discourage some species of fish from jumping, but an actual physical lid is the only way to guarantee they can't jump out of the tank. Next up are rosette plants like Echinodorus, Cryptocorynes and Lagonodendra. These plants are rooted in the substrate and then grow outwards from a central point. While some of these can send out runners, it tends to be at a very slow pace compared to most stolon plants, so it will take a while for these to start propagating, and even then only some types of rosette will do that, and the conditions have to be optimal. Next up are bulb plants like Tiger Lotus and Aponogetans, and I don't actually have any of these in my fish room right now, but you'll want to bury the bulb around halfway into the substrate and then just leave it to grow. Just be aware that some of these can also send out runners at a surprisingly fast pace, and when I recently removed the Tiger Lotus from my tank, I was surprised by how many runners and new bulbs it had sent out in just 4 months. Another type of plant to consider is moss, which is also an epiphyte similar to rhizome plants. But unlike rhizome plants, moss doesn't have a distinct structure with a rhizome where the stems and leaves will grow from. It's basically a single piece of plant material and everything will grow from there. Just like rhizome plants, you secure your moss to hardscapes such as driftwood or rocks, but a lot of people underestimate how much maintenance a lot of moss actually requires to keep it clean and looking good. And then finally we get to red plants, and this group is a little unique because it's actually defined by how the plant looks rather than the way it grows in our aquarium. For example, you can find red rhizome, floating, stem, stolon, rosette and even bulb plants in the hobby. While some red plants are easy to grow and get that red coloration, it can be challenging, and I do think that red plants are a little bit of a noob trap in the hobby, and a lot of people get them when their tank can't support them, but more on that later. Next up, we have how to find easy category aquarium plants that pretty much anyone can grow regardless of experience or tank setup. Now, there are a few different ways to do this, but in my opinion, using the free Denali or Tropica databases that I link in the video description is probably the quickest and easiest option for most people. Both of these databases let you search the full Tropica and Denali plant nursery databases for all of the plants they grow, and they'll offer tips and tricks on how to grow them and their requirements. If you are new to the hobby, I personally recommend you try and stick to the easier types of Anubias, Echinodorus, Cryptocorynes, stem plants and floating plants. That said, not every plant labelled as easy actually lives up to the name, and some of these can be surprisingly challenging and difficult to grow, and I have a dedicated video going over the easy plants to avoid in the hobby that I link in the description. Because tap water parameters can vary a lot depending on where you live, another great option is to ask people in your local area what is grown well in your local water. Local aquarium shops, local social media groups, and even local fish keeping groups can be a great way to find other people in the hobby who can offer you advice for things that work well in your area. I do think it is important to take note of the genus, species and variety name of the plant that you get recommended though, because this can be another area where people new to the hobby make mistakes. Take Cryptocoryne for example, because it's one of the most popular genus of plants in the hobby. Within that specific genus, you've got several species, including the Wentii species, which in turn includes several different varieties. But not all varieties within the species are created equally. Cryptocoryne Wentii Green is generally considered to be a very easy Cryptocoryne to grow in the hobby, while at the same time Cryptocoryne Wentii Flamingo is a far more demanding plant. But both of these are from the same genus and species, and they differ at variety level, so it is important to make sure you take full note of any plant's names you are recommended. Next up, I want to go over some basic equipment that you'll need to successfully grow plants in your aquarium. I will cover each of these in more detail as we work through the video, but in short, you're going to need a suitable light, some substrate, some form of fertilizer, and in some cases a heater. Now, if you are new to the hobby, this may sound like a lot and it is easy to feel overwhelmed at first, but we are not talking about the high-end expensive pieces of equipment. In fact, the vast majority of my fish room runs on budget-friendly lights, budget-friendly substrates, and it uses natural fertilization techniques to keep costs as low as possible. So let's move on to lighting basics, and I do have a dedicated video going over lighting for beginners, which I link in this video's description, that goes into a lot more depth. But in this day and age, there are still some guidelines like watts per litre and lumens per litre kicking around in the hobby, but modern LED technology is advancing at a rapid pace where these are quickly made redundant with each new generation of LED lights. So, in my honest opinion, I truly think that any modern LED plant-grown light on the market will be able to grow the majority of easy category plants in the hobby. Personally, I'm a huge fan of the Ciora SR616, which is one of the cheapest lights on the market right now, and I've grown a huge range of plants under it. But there are some challenges in the hobby that are becoming more difficult to navigate, because increasing the price of your light no longer means you are actually getting a better product for your money, because a lot of the previous generation of LED lights is still on the market. And on top of that, because a lot of brands don't really use a sequential number sequence such as 1, 2, 3, 4 to denote newer, more modern lighting units, it can be difficult to keep up. A good example of this is the Haiger 957, which is a solid light. I have 4 of them in my fish room and it's always performed well for me. But the newer Haiger 076 offers a similar lumen output at a similar price, but it requires less watts to run, so it actually keeps your electricity bill lower. Unfortunately, unless you know what to look for and go out and actually crunch the numbers for these lights, it's actually very difficult to work out which one of those is better, and even if you just do a surface level dive, they look very similar, but it's when you get to the watts per lumen count you work out, the 076 is far cheaper to run. But as the hobby progresses and new models do come out, I do think this is going to become even more confusing because brands aren't removing the older generations of lights off the market. Now I do want to quickly talk about Photoperiod, which is the amount of time your lights are on each day. Most of my tanks are set to get 6 hours of light per day with the light set to full intensity during the full 6-hour period. But there is also a different method called the Daily Light Integral method or DLI method that is becoming more and more popular because it does seem to be what MD Fish Tanks uses on his YouTube channel and gets great results with it. This specific method lets you enjoy your tank for longer periods each day without encouraging algae growth. It works by you lowering the intensity of your light and then letting it run for a longer period per day, so on paper your plants will still get the same amount of power every 24-hour period that they can use for growth, but you can keep your lights on longer and discourage algae growth. There's also the siesta method, which splits the light into 2 different photo periods throughout the day, and I have no direct experience with this method, but some people do like it. But if you are new to the hobby, I really do think that setting your light up for between 6 and 8 hours per day at close or at maximum intensity should get you good results. Next up we have substrate options, and for planted tanks there's 3 main types to choose from, which are cap dirt, aqua soil and inert substrates. Each one of these can work really well depending on your aquarium goals and setup. In my opinion, cap dirt is usually the most budget friendly setup, while aqua soil is usually the most beginner friendly setup. And if you're willing to stick to only epiphyte plants, then an inert substrate can leapfrog both of them and become the best option. So let's start with cap dirt, which I currently use in just under half of my tanks, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You take some topsoil or potting soil, which is intended for use in your garden for potted plants, and then you add between 1/2 inch and 1 full inch to the bottom of your tank, and then you cap it with either sand or gravel. This type of setup does release a lot of nutrients into the water column at first, so it's really important to monitor your water parameters and perform regular partial water changes until the tank stabilises, usually after around a month, but this can vary depending on exactly what's in the soil you use. Once the tank is established and starts to mature, so the ammonia and nitrite levels can stay at 0 ppm without you needing to do regular water changes, this does become a very budget friendly and effective option for planted aquariums. Now there is a bunch of different dirted tank methods in the hobby right now. My personal favourite by far is the Wallstad method, and I have a dedicated playlist for all of my content based on that in the video description. But it is important to keep your substrate layers separate because you really do need that capping layer over the dirt for this type of method to work. On top of that, it is also important that you stay on top of your water changes for the first month or so of setting the tank up, just to keep everything safe and stable. Next up we have aqua soil, but not all aqua soils are created equally, but in my opinion that is intentional and by design of the product. That's because there are some aqua soil products in the hobby that are specifically designed for low-tech tanks, while there's others aimed at high-tech setups, and their price reflects this. In my opinion, the best example of this is the Fluval aqua soil range. I currently use the regular Fluval stratum in just under half of my tanks right now, and I found it to be an excellent entry-level low-tech aqua soil option. According to Fluval's own website, this version of the aqua soil offers pH buffering, a high surface area for beneficial bacteria, and in my experience it also makes it very easy to bury your hardscape into the substrate if you're trying to achieve a specific aquascape style. Over time, the cation exchange capacity of the clay in the Fluval stratum does allow it to absorb some of the nutrients from the broken down fish waste in your water column and store them in the substrate for your plant roots to use as needed. But there's also the Fluval Biostratum aqua soil product, which is a more advanced version of. This version includes additional nutrients, minerals and trace elements, and it's essentially a pre-soaked version of aqua soil to boost the initial nutrient availability directly out of the bag. While this may sound great, I honestly don't think it's necessary in any way if you're using a low-tech aquarium similar to mine with more budget-friendly lighting and no CO2 injection. That's because the plants you keep in a low-tech setup simply can't grow fast enough to take advantage of the extra nutrients in the substrate because they are limited by their CO2 and lighting limitations. However, in a high-tech aquarium setup that is running expensive high-powered lighting as well as a CO2 injection system, the plant's growth rate can drastically increase and let the plants take advantage of those extra nutrients in the substrate, and that's where that price difference between the two products comes into play. Now, I'm lucky enough to live close to Horizon Aquatics, which is one of the best aquascaping stores here in the United Kingdom, and I try to pay them a visit every few months. I've seen firsthand how much faster the plants in their high-tech setups with expensive lighting and CO2 injection systems grow compared to mine, so I definitely understand why there's differences in the prices and the actual features of different aquasoil products on the market. That said, one of the main downsides of the nutrient-rich aquasoil products on the market, such as Fluval Biostratum or the ADA range, is that they have a lot of water-soluble nutrients in the aquasoil, so you need to do a lot of water changes during the initial setup of the tank. Now, this is specific to the more expensive aquasoils, but these water changes help to keep the ammonia levels under control after an initial setup. But personally, I also think these water changes are going to be removing a lot of the water-soluble nutrients that you've just paid more for. So yeah, I just stick to the more budget-friendly aquasoil products such as the regular Fluval stratum, but I know its price does vary depending on location as well. Now, just to be clear, in my experience, the regular cheaper Fluval stratum does release a small amount of ammonia into your tank water when you first set the tank up because it does contain organic material, but it is nothing near what I've seen other content creators share with their test kits when they are using Biostratum or the ADA range or some of the other popular aquasoils on the market. That brings us on to the inert substrates like sand and gravel. These don't really contain any nutrients directly out of the bag, and they usually have a very low cation exchange capacity too, limiting their ability to store nutrients from the water in the substrate. But it is worth pointing out that over time, mulm and detritus will fall into the little gaps and provide some nutrients to the plants in that way, but it will take time to build up. The big advantage of inert substrates, in my opinion, is just how budget friendly they are compared to something like aquasoil, and you can still build beautiful aquariums using them. My number one tip if you are new to the planted tank hobby and want to use an inert substrate is to just stick with epiphyte plants, because you can still create a beautiful scape using Bucephalandra, Anubias, Bulbitis and a couple of floating plants and maybe some Java Fern. That said, you can still grow rooted plants like rosettes in inert substrate like I am in my undergravel filter tank. While some of these are grown slower than they are in my aquasoil tanks, some of them are matching the growth rate of the ones that I took out of the exact same pot and put into my aquasoil beta tank at the exact same day. It's also worth pointing out that my undergravel filter tank has a couple of Medaka, some Neocaridina shrimp and some ram's horn snails in there, so it's really not a high bio load tank either. That means that the actual nutrients in the water column of that tank is surprisingly low, but still those rosette plants are grown without issue. But just to recap what I said back at the start of this section, in my opinion, capped dirt is usually the most budget friendly option, aquasoil is usually the most beginner friendly option, but if you are willing to stick with an epiphyte only setup, inert substrates can jump ahead of both of them. Next up we get to fertilization, and there's a few different options here depending on your specific setup as well as what you want to achieve with your planted tank. There's natural fertilization methods, liquid fertilization, substrate based nutrients and root tabs that can all be used in different ways, and I'll break each one down as we work through the video. The main goal of fertilization is to make sure that you are providing a balanced mix of macronutrients, secondary nutrients and micronutrients to support healthy growth without adding too many and causing algae blooms in your tank. But first I do want to break down each type of those nutrients just to avoid any confusion. Macronutrients are needed in the largest amounts and include nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, and they are commonly referred to as NPK due to their chemical symbols. Nitrogen and phosphorus are usually easy to come by in planted tanks thanks to fish waste and decaying organic matter containing plenty of both, but potassium can be harder to maintain and often needs some type of supplementation. Secondary nutrients include calcium, magnesium and sulfur, and these are needed in small amounts than macronutrients but in larger amounts than micronutrients. Some sources do lump these in with both macro and micronutrients depending on what they are specifically talking about, but more and more sources are starting to include them in their own category. Finally, we get to micronutrients, and these are needed in the smallest amounts of all of the nutrient types for plants, and these include pretty much everything else, but some key options are iron, zinc, boron and manganese. Now, there are some great infographics online that you can Google search which show the different signs of nutrient deficiencies in aquarium plants, but due to copyright reasons I can't show them in the video. If you do notice something wrong with one of your aquarium plants, simply Googling aquarium plant nutrient deficiency infographic should bring up the charts, and they can be very helpful helping you work out exactly what's wrong. Since this video is focused on low-tech planted tanks like the ones I personally run, it is important to remember that our plants grow far slower than the ones in high-tech tanks with expensive lighting and CO2 injection. That means that while we do still need to fertilise and make sure our plants have all the nutrients they need, they can be used at a far lower level because of the far slower growth rate. So getting into the actual fertilisation methods, and I want to start with natural fertilisation because it's my preferred method and I use it in the vast majority of my aquariums, and when used correctly it can work very well. The idea here is pretty simple, and you let organic matter like fish waste, uneaten food and decaying plant leaves decompose in your tank and release the nutrients that are contained within them. As this happens, the various different elemental compounds are released into the tank's water column where your plants can absorb them. Unlike terrestrial plants which rely heavily on soil nutrients absorbed via their roots, aquatic plants can uptake a surprisingly large amount of nutrients directly through their leaves and stems. So, as organic material decomposes in our aquariums and releases minerals into the water, your aquatic plants can benefit from a steady supply of nutrients without you needing to do anything. As I touched on earlier, potassium can still be a bit of a challenge, especially for epiphytes that don't have their roots in the substrate to get access to potassium in stuff like a capped dirt setup. To help with this, I have started feeding my shrimp and snails high potassium foods like spinach, oak leaves and dandelion leaves. So far it does seem to be working well, and the potassium deficiencies that I had in my Java Fern, one of my Anubias and a few other plants does seem to have cleared up from making this simple change. Next up, I want to talk about liquid fertilizers because there's a lot of products on the market and it can become overwhelming quickly. To simplify things, I do want to break these down into 3 main categories. First up, you have complete or general purpose liquid fertilizers. These contain all of the essential nutrients that your plants need for healthy growth, and they are designed to act as an all-in-one plant food. These are great for people who just want to dose a liquid fertilizer into their tank and need a simple, quick solution. Then we have light liquid fertilizers, and these include everything from the general purpose fertilizers apart from nitrogen and phosphorus. This is because in the average planted aquarium there's going to be plenty of nitrogen and phosphorus provided via fish waste being broken down in the tank. This type of liquid fertilizer can be particularly useful if you're trying to grow red plants in your aquarium. This is because one of the main things you have to do to get the deep red hues on your plants is limit nitrogen to create a stress response in the plant, so this type of liquid fertilizer isn't constantly adding more nitrogen to your tank while still adding plenty of other minerals for healthy, thriving growth. Then we have specialist fertilizers, and an example of this is API Leaf Zone, which only contains iron and potassium, which are 2 of the nutrients that are commonly deficient in aquariums. However, it is worth noting that the price of API Leaf Zone has almost doubled in my area recently, and it can be just as expensive as a complete or light fertilizer that contain far more minerals. If you do want to save money on liquid fertilization for your aquarium, it's worth checking out the free UCAPS liquid fertilizer calculator that I link to in the description. This is a great little tool that lets you replicate the nutrient profiles of a lot of popular liquid fertilizers in the hobby by mixing your own from dry nutrient salts and then adding water. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in low-tech tanks, the growth rate of our plants are considerably slower than in high-tech tanks, so I'm really not sure if liquid fertilizers are essential, and like I mentioned, personally, I prefer the natural fertilization method, and I only use liquid fertilizers in my betta fish tank because she's in there with a couple of shrimp and snails, so that's a low bioload tank with a lot of plants. So yeah, that is something you're going to have to decide on your own, but if you're new, my advice would be not to buy a liquid fertilizer until you actually observe nutrient deficiencies in your plants and then adjust accordingly. Next up is substrate fertilization, and while this definitely has its place in the hobby, I personally think that we are seeing a bit of a shift in the planted tank community to water column based fertilization. This is because a lot of the earlier assumptions in aquarium plant care came from research in terrestrial plants grown on ground in their out-of-water form. In that specific form, plants pull the majority of their nutrients from the ground via their roots because they have atmospheric air surrounding them. While that air provides plenty of CO2 to the plant, it does force the plant to pull the bulk of its nutrients from the substrate. But underwater, things work a little differently because water-soluble nutrients in the tank's water column actually end up surrounding the plant. As more testing is done into plants in their fully submerged aquatic form, it is starting to become clearer that at least some species of plants are perfectly capable of absorbing most of their nutrients from the water column. One example is this recent blog post from ADA, who are one of the most respected aquascaping brands in the hobby, and I link to the blog post in the description. Now, I do think there's some translation quirks from Japanese to English in that blog post, but to me it does read like ADA are starting to shift their recommendation towards water column fertilization. There's also this article from 2 Hour Aquarist that challenges the long-standing belief that both Cryptocoryne and Echinodorus plants are heavy root feeders, and these 2 research papers also seem to back that up, that they can take water fertilization perfectly fine. That said, substrate fertilization does still have some advantages, especially in cap dirt setups. That's because the soil in these tanks contain a wide range of bacteria right out of the pack that we can put to use. Some of these bacteria also help to break down the organic material in the soil and produce a small amount of natural CO2, giving our plants a quick boost in the tank. In fact, Diana Wallstad, who helped popularise the cap dirt methods, includes a table in her book that goes over the mineral content of soil and how long each of those nutrients last in an average planted tank. While some nutrients such as carbon can deplete fairly quickly, others like potassium and iron remain available for a long period of time, helping to prevent deficiencies in rooted plants. The only limitation with that is that it is in the substrate, so as I touched on earlier, epiphyte plants like Anubias and Java Fern and moss don't directly benefit. But again, as I mentioned earlier, that's where things like liquid fertilizers come in, or feeding your shrimp and snails high potassium foods such as spinach and dandelion leaves. Moving on, and we get to root tab fertilization, and these are small capsules or little tablets that you insert into the substrate to create nutrient-rich zones that plants can access through their roots. Now, these are a popular option in the hobby, but personally I really don't think they're that useful in low-tech tanks. That said, root tabs do have their place in high-end aquascapes in my opinion, particularly when you are using them to deliver nutrients in a more targeted way to specific plants. For example, some root tabs contain non-water soluble nitrogen which stays locked in the substrate and becomes available when plants' roots reach it. Now, this is a very different strategy to the ones that I mentioned with light liquid fertilizers earlier that just skip nitrogen out of the formula completely. With these root tabs, you can selectively provide nutrients, including nitrogen, to specific plants while depriving it from others, helping you get those deep red hues from your red plants by not putting the root tab under those, but putting them under your green plants for healthy growth there. Moving on, and we get to heating your aquarium specifically to benefit your aquarium plants. While a heater may not be necessary due to your location, it can definitely help keep your plants growing consistently throughout the year. I do have a dedicated video sharing my experiences from last winter with my room temperature aquariums and the plants in those, where the tank felt around 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit, and I link that in the description. But while some of the plants in those tanks were perfectly fine, some of them definitely had issues due to the water temperature dropping too low. That's because many aquatic plants, even some of them native to cooler regions like the UK, will enter a dormancy phase when the water gets too cold, meaning their growth stops or drastically slows down. We are currently in the middle of the spring here in the UK, so my room temperature tanks have drastically warmed up, so I have an excellent example of this. As you can see here, my Hygrophila siamensis 53B is a perfect example, and you can clearly see the older, larger pre-winter leaves with the holes and damage to them, and then there's plenty of new, healthy, smaller post-winter growth coming through on the plant. The tricky thing is that there doesn't seem to be a universal temperature threshold to avoid dormancy in aquatic plants because they come from such a wide range of different countries. But depending on the specific species of fish that you keep in your aquarium, this may not even be an issue. For example, I keep my bettas at 27 degrees Celsius or 81 degrees Fahrenheit year round, and this helps to avoid dormancy in the aquatic plants in their tanks. But I do plan to add heaters to my room temperature tanks moving on, even though the actual fish species in there don't need it. My current thinking is to maintain a temperature of 22 degrees Celsius or 72 degrees Fahrenheit year round for the plants, just to avoid dormancy setting in and promote healthy growth throughout the winter. Moving on, and we get to CO2, and I honestly think that this is one of the most misunderstood topics in the planted tank hobby. To better understand this, it does help to first understand the differences between the two types of aquatic plants we keep in the hobby, which are obligate aquatic plants and amphibious plants. Obligate aquatic plants include things like Vallisneria, Kabomba, Blixia japonica, hornwort and Alodia. This type of plant doesn't actually have an above-water terrestrial form and needs to be kept submerged to survive. What makes them unique is their ability to use carbon from the bicarbonate or KH reading in our aquarium as a carbon source. Now, this doesn't appear to be as efficient as actual CO2, but it does help to reduce the amount of CO2 required in our aquariums if you are keeping that type of plant. Then we have amphibious plants, which make up the majority of the species we keep in the hobby. These plants can live both submerged or underwater or immersed, with most of the plant out of water, and they are typically native to regions like India, Southeast Asia, the Amazon and parts of Africa, where seasonal changes like the monsoon and wet seasons create massive changes in river levels. These wet seasons can last as long as 4 months, so these plants can be underwater for around a third of the year, and this has forced some unique evolutionary traits in them. While some of these amphibious plants like Hygrophila polysperma have also evolved to be able to process carbon from the bicarbonate or KH reading in our tanks, there's also other ones that have drastically reduced their carbon requirement to survive these 4 months of the year. So while all aquatic plants do require some form of carbon, the type and amount of carbon they need can vary. Thankfully, in low-tech aquariums, we also have some natural sources of CO2 which can provide the carbon required for these plants. Now, this won't be anywhere near the level of a CO2 injection system, but it can easily support the needs of a surprisingly large number of different aquarium plants. The two main natural sources of CO2 we have in our aquariums are respiration from our livestock and decomposition of organic material in the tank. Now, if you remember back at the start of the video, I did recommend that you check out the Tropica or Denylate plant databases to find easy category plants, and thankfully, a lot if not all of those plants are perfectly fine with low, natural levels of CO2. I've even kept some medium and advanced category plants in my low-tech tanks without issue, even though on these database pages it does say they need high amounts of CO2. So just to try and summarise the CO2 section, because some advanced and medium difficulty plants do require CO2 injection for optimal growth, there are still plenty of plants in the hobby that can survive on natural CO2 sources. Moving on, and we get to water flow, as in having the water in your aquarium actually move around. Since our plants are stationary, they rely on us moving the nutrients in the water column to them rather than them moving to the nutrients. And this is another area that's often misunderstood in the hobby, especially by beginners, because there's not only 2 types of water flow, there's also 2 sets of different flow rate recommendations. So let's start with the 2 different types of water flow, which are active and passive. To me, active water flow involves equipment which uses electricity, such as your filter, air stones, power heads, or even low-powered USB pumps. And then we have passive water flow, which relies on natural movement within the tank, such as your livestock swimming around or temperature-driven water movement due to convection. Passive water flow is weaker than active water flow, but in certain low-tech setups it's still easily enough to get the job done and move nutrients to your plants. I currently have 3 filterless Wallstad method tanks that use passive water flow, and 2 of those are over a year old now and there's no problems in either of them. And that brings us on to the second part of the water flow conversation, which is how much flow is actually needed in your tank, and this is usually measured by how many times your tank water volume is turned over per hour. Now, a lot of sources do recommend a rate of between 5 and 10 times turnover per hour, but this is commonly recommended for high-tech aquariums that use high-powered lighting, CO2 injection, and are often using high amounts of liquid fertilizer with the estimated indexing method. If you are running a low-tech planted tank, this does not apply to us. It's a very specialist thing for a very specific type of aquarium. And then we have the more standard 2 to 4 times turnover per hour, which is more appropriate for low-tech setups, and this recommendation is usually done for the actual mechanical filtration of your filter and getting the water turned over enough times for your filter floss to catch all of the particulate matter. But by coincidence, it also works very well for moving nutrients around the tank in a low-tech setup. The majority of my setups are nano tanks between 25 and 45 litres, and one filter that I really like for this water volume is the Nicru Slimline Hang-On Back. It has a maximum flow rate of 160 litres per hour, which gives me around 6 times turnover in my 25 litre tanks and 3.5 times turnover in my 45 litre tanks. But unfortunately, out of the box, this filter really isn't optimized that much, but I go over how I customize the filter in my video on nano tank filters, and I link to that in the description. As I mentioned, I do currently have 3 filterless tanks that only use passive water flow sources, but I don't recommend this for beginners. It does make it more difficult in my opinion. Finally, I want to quickly touch on red plants, because this is a common trap that catches a lot of beginners out on the low-tech side of the hobby. A lot of beginners buy red plants expecting them to eventually develop their deep red hues, but some of them will simply melt away while others will just develop a green or brown hue. Now, there are some red plants in the hobby that are considered easier to grow, such as red Tiger Lotus and Ludwigia Mini Super Red, but even then these still need specific conditions for optimal red coloration. Typically, this is a combination of high-powered light intensity and low nitrogen availability, triggering a stress response in the plant to display red colours. While it is possible to get red hues in some plants without using expensive high-end lighting, most beginners start with entry-level lights, which make it more difficult. And while reducing nitrogen does sound easy, because you could in theory just do a lot of water changes if your tap water doesn't have much nitrate in it, this can become challenging because it may be depriving essential nutrients to your other plants. That said, I do get the appeal and I do want to work with red plants more moving forward in my future tanks, but it's not as easy in a low-tech setup as a lot of people think. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. I hope it's been helpful. Thanks for watching and good luck with your planted tanks.